Good evening. This is Pastor Rick, and yes, I am giving this a try for the first time, so go easy on me. I'm sure if I were sitting with you, I would hear some interesting comments about me, uh, like making fun. So here's the deal. Roxy just made me keto cupcakes a few minutes ago, and I ate them, and I had this set up all ready to hit a button, and I realized that after eating the keto cupcakes, that because this is up close and personal, a face shot, wow, you were going to see chocolate chip cookies and various portions of cupcake in my teeth. See, they're clean, so I'm good. Hopefully you can see it. I'm challenged with lighting in our home. I've ordered some equipment that will come, but it's not here yet, that will help me with the lighting to clarify some features and give a better picture. And also, hopefully, I will get a microphone that is better suited as well. But this is my first attempt, so bear with me, and here I am. So, we are continuing our Wednesday night Bible study on the 7 miracles of Jesus as recorded in the book of John. Now, that is unique, as you know, because there are 43 miracles recorded concerning Jesus in the entire Gospels, but only 7 that John focuses on. So we have focused onto that, and I think there's some meaning there. Just real quick, I want to give you a rundown of where we've been in case you haven't even been involved in these Bible studies. The first miracle we looked at was concerning Jesus as a winemaker, and it's the story, the encounter of him turning water into wine. I kind of like that one, and what amazes me about that one is that it wasn't about a life-saving event or a big event, but it was about a faith-saving event. In other words, it was Jesus at a wedding, and his mother was upset and concerned for her friend that, hey, there's no more wine, and what are we going to do? And she didn't actually tell him to do it, but Jesus, the Son of God, and also the Son of Mary, uh, turned the water into wine. So mama influence, right? Miracle 2, we take a look at the incident where Jesus healed the royal official's son from a distance. And one of the things it teaches us is that God is not limited by space and time. He didn't have to be where the royal official was. He just spoke the word and it happened. And what faith that took him at his word. Wow. If we were just a little more like that, if we were just a little more like the royal official and took him at his word that he is not limited by where we are or what time it is. Then miracle 3 was the incident of Jesus at the pool of Bethsaida, healing the man that was an invalid. And we saw that he was there because of other reasons. He was there because there was a stirring of the waters, and because people were being healed. If they got in after the stirring of the waters, nobody understood it. But Jesus was there basically to say, I am the source of all true healing. And I don't need those things that maybe can't be unexplained. I am the one that brings healing. Now, miracle 4, I entitle the Master Chef. And it's the incident where Jesus fed the 5,000, but not really. It was really more like 20,000. Bunch of male chauvinist pigs didn't even count the 5,000, the men and the ladies and children. And so if you really look at the scenario, Jesus didn't just feed the men. He fed all those that were there. It was about 20,000, most biblical scholars say. And one of the applications that comes to mind is that just because we lack resources doesn't mean that he does. Our lack of resources is not God's lack of resources. And then the miracle we looked at last week was about sight giver, where Jesus restored the sight of a man born blind. That is, he never had any experience of seeing anything ever. And Jesus not only restored his ability to see with his eyes, but he also gave him the ability to understand what he was seeing. He gave him vision. And tonight, I'm almost tempted to say, and tonight's episode, but this is really a session, right? We are going to talk about the miracle of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Lots of Sunday school stories about that, lots of things you've learned all in your entire life about that. And I think it's one of the coolest miracles Jesus did. So he went all the way in the book of John from doing what seemingly is a minor personal miracle to overcoming death and robbing the grave of Lazarus of its body or of its corpse. So we'll talk more about that, but I want to take the time, if you will, let's just read that. I'm going to read it with you and make some comments along the way, and then we're going to point out some observations and some reveals, if you will, about what's taken place. John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44 gives us the story that you're familiar with, but maybe you haven't read it recently. So let's go with God's word. It says, "Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Now this Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.' When he heard this, Jesus said, 'This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it.' Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. In other words, Rick translation, he was close to them. They were tight. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. That's perplexing. And then he said to his disciples, 'Let us go back to Judea.' 'But Rabbi,' they said, 'a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back?' Translation being, 'Are you out of your mind?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours of daylight? And anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light.' There's a light here of opportunity. That's not talking about the zombie apocalypse or what people look like when you go shopping at the grocery store. So after he had said this, he went on to tell them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up.' His disciples replied, 'Lord, if he sleeps, he will just get better.' See, they didn't want to go. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. You see, to God, death is sleep. It's not death. So then he told them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead.' Okay, flat out here, guys. Get it? He's dead. 'And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.' And then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, 'Let us also go that we may die with him.' Like, sure, that's just great. Now we can all be dead. They'll kill us all. We'll be as dead as Lazarus." He didn't say that, but that's what he meant, okay? On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and so that meant many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Martha went out to meet Jesus. She probably didn't go out to meet all her Jewish friends. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha thought Jesus was talking religious talk. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. And after she had said this, and what did she say? Yes, I believe. She went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Wow, sisters, they must have, been raised together or something. I don't know. Said the same thing. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And this is the famous shortest scripture in all of the Bible. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? So they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? They were upset that he had healed people, that he had given sight to the blind man. And now they're saying, well, okay, if he's all that, can he even raise people from the dead? Big jump. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor, for he had been in there 4 days. We are talking major stink, okay? Jesus doesn't care if there's major stink. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. It's interesting that in this case, Jesus's prayer was not just really a prayer if God would do something, but it was a prayer so that others would learn what God was able to do. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And that's putting it mildly. We'll talk about this in a minute. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let this poor guy go. Okay, here's some observations, and I'm sure you got lots of stuff rolling around in your mind. Maybe you're thinking, what happened to all of Pastor Rick's hair? Well, hey, I've always been this way, okay, for a long time. Here's the first observation. We need to realize that in this miracle 7 of Jesus robbing the grave of Lazarus, that he addresses our concept as earthbound human beings, average Joes. Jesus addresses our concept of finality. We have this thought that what's done is done, and what's happened has happened. And you know what? Jesus isn't bound by that. That's not so with Jesus. It's not over until he says it's over, right? This is good coffee. You recall the movie Superman, the one where Lois Lane is in an earthquake in Arizona or Nevada or someplace, and this big earthquake crack opens up, and her car is kind of drops into it, and it just gets worse and worse. And Superman, which is alias Clark, is really Clark Kent, is in love with Lois Lane, and when he sees her and he finally is able to get to her from trying to save the rest of the world, he finds her dead. And so Superman goes nuts and swirls around the world, and he reverses time, and he does everything he can to undo what was done. But the truth is, even if you are Superman, if you are not God, you can't undo things that have already been done. For instance, if, let's say, Roxy were to make me chocolate chip cookies and bake them and set them out, you know what? You can't unbake a good batch of chocolate chip cookies. In fact, you can't unbake a bad batch of chocolate chip cookies. What's done is done, right? That's an earthly limitation we have. You know what? You cannot uncut your hair. You really can't. Once it's cut, you can't uncut it. When I first had my shave or very close cut, it was by accident that the barber did that. They read the wrong file or the wrong record. They got the wrong Feist, and the Feist that they cut the hair for was Joe Feist, whom I've never met, and he got a number 2. So when I went in for a trim, I said, just give it to me like you always have in the past. They started hacking away at my hair with that trimmer. I'm like, whoa, what's going on? And then we discovered it. But by then I had this groove right up the middle of my hair. You can't undo what hair that's been cut, right? And you know what? You can't unrun red lights. If you've run it, it's done. And there is nothing on earth that can change that. If you don't think that's true, just ask the Springfield Police Department, who has cameras at a lot of intersections. I believe they still do. So there is on planet Earth, which is where we live, what I call a law of diminishment, if you will. And it's built into our living as citizens of planet Earth. And it's there because of the fall, because of original sin. Okay? So from the day we are born, the law of diminishment, from the day we are born, it's not fair, kicks in. And eventually we develop and then undevelop, and there's things taking place in our cells that will eventually lead to the end of life and our earthly existence. You know, as soon as we're born, we're starting to get older, even though our cells might be growing. The law of diminishment. That wasn't always the case before the fall. Unless there is an outside force or an outside power which intervenes to disrupt this law of diminishment, we will see the law of diminishment play out every time in every situation. I want you to think of your refrigerator or your freezer. The purpose of a refrigerator or a freezer is to keep food cold, right? To break or to intervene in the law of diminishment, because that food wants to decay. But if you keep it cold and if you keep it frozen, we stop that. But the only reason you can do that in our modern living is because there is a power that enables a compressor to produce that cold air and to sustain that temperature. If you unplug that dude, or if you lose your power, guess what? The law of diminishment kicks in. And after 4 days, you open that thing up, it's ugly. Unless, it might have better insulation, but I think you get my point. Here's reveal number 1 from Miracle 7, okay? This is an application to our living as his disciple. Here it is, reveal 1. Jesus demonstrates in this encounter that he intervenes. Who? He intervenes in the law of diminishment. He is the power that overcomes even death. His encounter with Lazarus and Martha and all the folks that were mourning and the whole cast of characters is an obvious foreshadow of what he would demonstrate later through the cross and resurrection for all of us for each and every one of us on a personal level. But it certifies with Lazarus kind of in advance. Hey, this is what's going to take place. The disciples didn't understand it, but that's what happened. It certifies in advance that this intervention will be up close and personal for each of us. Jesus did die for everybody, but he also died and went to the cross and rose again and conquered death for you individually. And it's not just limited to the death of our body. You know, we experience death in many ways in our lives, and our bodies still are functioning, but something has died within us. And there are many ways in which this occurs. You can say broken dreams, or disappointments, or hardships, or challenges, or things that just don't work out, or betrayal, or lack of trust. Many deaths in which something was alive and vibrant, perhaps a relationship, and then it dies, okay? And what Jesus is demonstrating with Lazarus is that he can intervene in any form of death and bring new life into it, his life, the life of Jesus Christ. I want you to pause with me just a moment and take a look at Jewish burial customs. Now, these are kind of weird, okay? I mean, to us today. You know, today, if you are buried, you either get cremated or you, and I know this sounds morbid, or you go to a funeral director and they inject preservatives and stuff in you. They clean your fluids. And I've actually seen this done. I had to take a course in this. Don't know why, but I did. Anyway, that's how we do it today. It's much neater, it's cleaner, it's hygienic. Here's what the Jewish people did in Jesus' day. When a person died, they took his feet and bound them at the ankles, and they tied his arms to his body. And so then the body is wrapped in about, now get this, 100 pounds of grave cloth, most of them linens. 100 pounds. That's heavier than my wife. Wow. Way heavier than my wife. See, I got to stay on the good side. Okay. So then we know that his head was wrapped in what would probably result in it being a foot in diameter. So his head would look like a big ball of cloth, about a foot in diameter. So it's interesting when Jesus called Lazarus to come forth, how that really played out. It mentions that he still had the cloths on him. I'm wondering if he hopped out, you know, if he's got his feet bound and his arms are tied to his side. Lazarus come forth, you know, Lazarus is doing the dance, right? He's doing the Lazarus hop dance and he's coming out. Now, it's possible that Jesus handled this the same way that it took place with him, where, you know, all the stuff basically disintegrated, but it mentions that Lazarus still had some of his grave cloths or wrapping around him still. So that's interesting, and it brings us to reveal 2, or application 2, about this miracle 7 encounter. Jesus intervened. Write this down, put it in your head. Jesus intervenes not only to bring new life or to bring resurrection, he also intervenes to displace all we do to reinforce the finality of death. And we do lots of that. We fight naturally against death. And it's not just the death of the body. Trust me, I've been with lots of people, unfortunately, over the years in ministry that have been nearing the time of death. And they all have their own unique way in fighting it. And I will too. But we're not talking about just death of the body. Have you ever had a dream or goal or, say, ambition that you really wanted to see happen, but when hindrance occurred, You gave up and wrapped it up in the tomb of despair and hopelessness. You put 100 pounds of stuff all around it and said, it's done, it's finished. Well, Jesus is not hindered by that. And when he intervenes and when he resurrects and when he brings new life, even the despair that we wrap things in, and even the hopelessness that we wrap things in, and even the way in which we say it's done, there's no way it's going to happen, if Jesus wants to bring new life, that's not going to stop him. 100 pounds of grave cloths or anything else is not going to stop him from reviving that issue or that challenge or that dream in your life. So let's move on. Let me take a sip of coffee here. I might add, this is great coffee, and it's in my bicycle mug. Keep rolling on, right? Okay. Let's talk about repurposing. That is a popular term, right? A popular activity these days. I think there's some reality TV shows on here and there about that specific activity. We like to take things that are junk or somebody else's junk and give them new life by giving them new purpose, giving them new relevance by giving them a new use, and adapting them to a new use. Tonight, for instance, I am struggling with getting the right kind of light here. Apparently we have a dark house. We don't have any overhead lights that fill. And I have taken a magnifying light that Brittany had to help her do crochet. And guess what? That is now my light that at least makes it so I don't look like Casper the Friendly Ghost quite as much. Okay? And it's helping with this production tonight. Think about it when you think about repurposing. When Jesus overcomes death, as he did with Lazarus, and he did on behalf of each of us after the cross and in the resurrection, he not only conquers death, he kind of repurposes the risen life that he's given us, right? Let me ask you a question. Did you even ever think about what happened to Lazarus after Jesus called him to come forth, after Jesus robbed his grave and made it empty? We know that Lazarus, that happened to Lazarus, but you don't see much about what happened to Lazarus afterwards. Well, there's two schools of thought on that, two what they call church traditions, okay? That's a fancy historical theologian type term. It's what people in the church thought, two schools of thought, okay? One church tradition says he and his sisters went to the island of Cyprus where they established a church at Kidion. And there is a church that exists in that same location today named the Church of Saint Lazarus, and it is believed to be built on his second tomb. Now, it doesn't tell us any more in that tradition, like, what he did, other than sounds like he pastored a church. A second church tradition says Lazarus and his sisters went to France. That's Cyprus, okay? A city, Marseille. There he hid from the persecution of Nero, a Roman emperor, and Domitian by hiding in tombs, which, he knew something about anyway. And we find out in this tradition that he was later beheaded when caught. So here's the point. Jesus repurposed Lazarus just by calling him forth from the grave. Jesus actually used Lazarus' death and his entombment, his finality, as he put it, so that we might believe. I'm not sure what else Lazarus actually accomplished in his second life, but the principle is this, and this leads us to reveal 3. Are you ready for reveal 3? That's 3 fingers. See, got that? I got to learn which way to go on this camera. Jesus gives new life when he overcomes death, and we are repurposed. Scripture tells us, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Remember, the personal deaths, not just the physical, but the personal deaths of your ambitions and dreams and goals, things that disappoint you, all those kind of deaths that kind of cause you to die in some way inside in your life, all of those personal deaths that we may experience in this life are not just about us, but they have the potential to speak life into other people as well. The value of Lazarus being out of the grave, the value of the robbery that Jesus did in taking his body out of the grave, was that others would see God is able to do anything, and others would glorify God. And sometimes our suffering or our loss or our pain is a means, and we don't like to think of this, that God can use to help others. Dr. Charles Crabtree, whom I've run across now and then, published a sermon, which, hey, I did read, and it was entitled God's Grammar. I thought that was an interesting sermon title. And he says this: never put a comma where God puts a period, and never put a period where God puts a comma. It's all about grammar, right? God repurposes us, and he can repurpose us like he did Lazarus and use his death even for glory. So here's another area I want you to think about. And, as I read this account, I got to say, I would probably be sad if I were Mary or Martha. What was Jesus thinking? I mean, have you ever found yourself asking that question? I mean, he got word that Lazarus was dying and he hung around 2 more days. He actually got there 4 days late. Jesus was late. Of course, he wasn't. In human terms, he was way late, okay? I mean, you'd have been mad. I'd have been mad. Not only does our faith sometimes struggle with God's ability to actually overcome death, we're thinking, that can't happen, especially the death of our dreams or ambitions, we also struggle with trusting God's timing. And the two go hand in hand. When Jesus decides to intervene and disrupt the law of diminishment, let me say it again, diminishment, when he decides to do that, he does it on his timetable, not necessarily ours. Let's look at the timing of all this in Lazarus incident. Jesus actually delays. He hangs around, and it would seem takes his good old time before making his way to Lazarus. And it's kind of the same thing that took place with the royal official's son in Miracle 2 that we looked at earlier in this series, where Jesus didn't rush right away to go over there, and instead he just handled it from a distance. We say, hey, Jesus is God. Can't he just teleport over there? Can he do better than Star Trek? Can't he just beam over there or something and take care of all this? Wow. I think this is a question why Jesus delayed that we'll probably have to ask him, but we can speculate. Sometimes that's fun, as long as it doesn't get us in trouble. Why did Jesus approach the situation like this? Here are some thoughts, and I'm sure you can add your own thoughts to these. As I get better with Facebook, you'll have the opportunity to do that, actually. There's times you can contribute, but I'll need someone to collect your comments because you'll type them in. We're not there yet. Here's one thought. Jesus wanted to demonstrate that Lazarus was indeed dead. As one of our former evangelists used to say, that he was indeed dead to the dead, 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 by all human definition. To Jesus, the death of those who know him really is just sleep. So that's why he first called it sleep. But to us, sleep is not dead. It's sleep. It's snore city. It's stacking Z's. Okay. It's coma in this case. But Jesus is saying this Lazarus is really dead. It's just I can't quite say that because I know he's not. Dead is dead, not sleep. So Jesus had to clarify this for his disciples, and waiting 4 days kind of reinforces their understanding that, look, yeah, I guess he really is dead. Okay. Even though just sleeping from Jesus' perspective, Jesus could not resurrect something that was not already dead. So he had to establish the certainty of death for his disciples. Reveal 4. Are you ready for this? And don't worry, I don't have 20 reveals, okay? God's perspective of what we call death is far different from ours. Let me explain. Death is in itself a test of our faith. It really is. It may be that Jesus was testing the faith of his followers. Okay? How much do you really believe me? Remember, he had to ask Martha, do you believe? After she stated what she believed. Hey, you're the resurrection. But she didn't personalize it. The test for Thomas did not go as well. Okay? Remember, he says, then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. In other words, he wasn't getting it at all. He also just saw death. So he flunked the test that was being taught in dealing with death. The test for Martha revealed something extraordinary about her faith. Even though it appears she was almost upset with Jesus. Even in her being upset, and I think I would be a little bit, you know, even in her midst of her being upset, she recognized that Jesus had the final call. She says to Jesus, Lord, and in this encounter, let's just read it in verse 21. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Let me make a note here that we need to remember whenever we think of God and how he intervenes and disrupts the law of diminishment. This is how faith works in our lives. As we face challenge and loss and disappointment, the fact that God can and is able and may very well intervene will often be out of touch with what we perceive as reality. Or should I say, our reality. That's because God intervenes from a place that we aren't. And God calls the shots. He is not bound by the same things that we are bound by. And so if he intervenes and robs the grave of your destroyed ambitions and your destroyed hopes and your destroyed expectations and all those kinds of things, when he calls that out of the grave and instills his new life into it, it may not resemble reality at all. We have to recognize that's why it's called a miracle. That's why it's called a God thing and not an us thing. And the most beautiful thing is in the world is when we allow God to do his thing, when we allow God to do his stuff. And when we realize that us at the point of our deepest need is God at the point of his greatest opportunity, if we believe and like Martha say, yes, I believe. Here's a question for you. This has been asked, and there's lots of answers on this. Why did Jesus cry? Well, here are some of my thoughts, and it's scary when I have thoughts. And once again, you may have other thoughts, and they're probably better. But I'm saying maybe Jesus didn't cry because he was sorrowful for Lazarus' passing. I mean, why would he be? He knew what was going to happen. He knew that, yeah, he's dead, but we're going to fix that. After all, Jesus knew all about death and how he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. So it's hard for me to fathom that he's weeping because Lazarus is dead, especially when he's about to say, "Come forth." I'm so sad you're dead. Oh, come on. Maybe his crying was more about the disappointment and grief that he saw in those that Lazarus loved and those that were surrounding him. To me, I believe Jesus weeping shows that he does indeed feel our grief. And he knows your pain when you have loss, whatever that loss looks like. If it's an actual loss of a loved one in physical death, or if it's a loss of that in your life which you thought was going to be different, or hope, or a dream. And as the Son of Man, it brought him to the point of tears. He was very much us and in the boat with us, like he was with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. And maybe Jesus wept because he knew that his delay, which was necessary to increase the faith and teach the lesson of his ability to overcome death, he knew it was going to be a hard lesson and it would have pain and difficulty for his followers. And it's one of those things, I need to teach you this, but I wish you didn't have to go through this. And so he had some sorrow for that, in that he empathized with that pain. Reveal 5. You ready for this? Yes. Say yes, Pastor Rick. Say amen. Something. I don't know. I don't hear any amens here. Okay. As we face various trials and tests, this is Reveal 5. God is so very aware of what we are going through. He really is. And Jesus weeps for you. You know, I believe in our prayer life, when we cannot pray as we need to or do, we are told in God's word that the Holy Spirit intercedes for us, mirroring what Jesus demonstrated in the flesh regarding those loss of Lazarus. The Spirit takes on our sorrow that we can't even express or manage and intercedes for us to help us pray. That's awesome, isn't it? And Jesus was modeling that in the case of Lazarus being called forth and those who were learning from that. Romans 8:26 through 27 says, "In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God." Reveal 6, and we'll close. If we were in person, you'd start to be getting fidgety now. And the good news is that, hey, you know what? I will not go an hour on here because of all the other stuff that we usually do. Here it is, Reveal 6. I think there are there it is. There's the screen. 2 degrees of faith that are shown us in this Miracle 7. I like to categorize things. I like to define things. That helps me. I don't know if it helps you. But there are 2 degrees of faith shown in Miracle 7 in which Jesus is the robber of not only Lazarus' grave, but our graves. The first is this: preventative faith. You got that? Preventative faith. In this encounter, Martha had this. She believed that Jesus could stop something from happening even before it happened, like her brother's death. She said, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. He would not have died. And the truth is, Martha eventually had to let that go and come to the point where she could accept her brother's death and then just trust God for the rest, for the outcome. I believe during that 4-day period, she reached that point. Even though she knew there was nothing impossible with God, she reached the point where she let it go and would just go with whatever God had. And Jesus shows up, right? He shows up. I believe we should carefully work out our own salvation with fear and trembling when it comes to our ambitions and our goals and our dreams and our aspirations. As we work those things out with God, they shouldn't just be about us, but they should be God driven and they should be God directed. And sometimes they are, hopefully most of the times they are, but sometimes, let's face it, self enters in and they're not. And so when that takes place, we need to recognize when to let them go and just lay them at his feet and let them die. Even the ones that God has given, and we've reached the point where it's not seeming to work out and it seems like it's dead and not happening. We need to just let it go and trust Jesus. I do believe there are times when we need to let something go or let something die or let someone go and then trust God for what he deems best. It could be a toxic relationship. It may be a dream that is not really God driven or one that is. It may be a selfish pursuit instead of a godly pursuit. You make the call as you work out your own salvation with him through prayer and reading the word and meditating on the word and listening and enjoying communion with the Holy Spirit. The second faith displayed or demonstrated in this encounter is resurrection faith. Resurrection faith is faith that does not put a period where God puts a comma. Resurrection faith says it's not over until God says it's over. Resurrection faith recognizes that even what we think is failure or total loss, God can and will do a new thing in accord with his will and purpose. Let me close. Remember what Jesus asked Martha? Jesus said to her, verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? And Martha said, Yes, Lord. What are you? Take that. God bless you. Let me have a closing prayer with you, if you will. Lord, as we are gathered not in the same place, but together, we are reminded that you are not bound by space or time. There may be those that listen to this thing later. There may be those that are listening to this in their bedroom or in their car. That doesn't matter. And Lord, there are probably many of us who need to know again that you can rob our graves. That stuff that we've put in graves and called dead to the dead maybe, because it's not working. It seems hopeless to us. It seems just far-fetched. It seems out of touch with reality. And yet we can't seem to give it up. And so, first of all, to let you have it, to somehow give it over and trust you that you are able to do what you will do. And to trust that you are working out your purpose in us as we are obedient, and that you will work out your will and purpose in us in accordance with your will. And Lord, I pray tonight that most of all, you would help us to be able to answer that question as Martha did and say, yes, I believe. Lord, I pray your blessing upon all those that might be a part of this, as well as our entire church during crazy times. And may we see how you want to call forth death out of this grave and bring new life. Let us trust you and live in your word and in your name. I pray. Amen. Thanks, folks. I hope you have a good evening. And as soon as I find the off button, I am signed off. End live. See ya.
You came up to my main That's where it showed up.